The rain did not wash the island clean. It merely slicked the grime, turning the red earth into a treacherous, sucking mud that clung to Dr. Alan Grant's boots with the tenacity of a living thing. Beside him, the Murphy children, Lex and Tim, moved with the jerky, exhausted movements of refugees. The humidity was a physical weight, pressing down on them, smelling of ozone, crushed vegetation, and the distant, lingering taint of diesel and tragedy. They had fled the visceral terror of the Tyrannosaurus rex, the thunder of its footfalls still vibrating in their marrow, only to find themselves swallowed by a deeper, more ancient darkness. The main tour road was a fractured ribbon of asphalt behind them, lost in the encroaching jungle. They were navigating a labyrinth of high-tension cables and ominous, geometric signage that bore no resemblance to the educational placards of the main loop. Alan kept a protective hand hovering near Lex's shoulder, his paleontologist's mind racing to categorize their surroundings, seeking order in the chaos. The fencing here is excessive. He looked up. Massive steel pylons, sunk deep into the earth, held up a web of cabling thick as a man's wrist. It rose 3 stories high, crowned with outward curving spikes that gleamed wickedly in the dying light. It was a fortress wall, not a simple containment fence. "Why is it so high?" Lex asked, wiping sweat from her brow. At 12, she possessed a hacker's intuition for systems and flaws, a sense that the world was code waiting to be cracked. "For herbivores." "Definitely not," Tim answered before Alan could, his voice steadying as he fell back on the comfort of facts. At 11, he was a walking encyclopedia of the Cretaceous. "Parasaurolophus. I heard them earlier. That low, resonant honking? But they don't need this. This is, I don't know. This is like the San Diego Zoo, but for things that eat the zookeepers." Alan paused, straining his ears. Tim was right. Somewhere in the mist-shrouded distance, the mournful, tuba-like calls of Parasaurolophus echoed. It was a sound he associated with placid, swamp-dwelling herds. Yet here they were, patrolling the perimeter of a maximum security enclosure. "Stay close," Alan ordered, his instincts screaming that they had wandered off the map, literally and metaphorically. "We need to find a maintenance access point, get back to the main road. The visitor center is our only hope." They pushed on, the tension knotting their muscles. The vegetation here was different, denser, more primal. Enormous ferns drooped under the weight of the air, was thick with the smell of stagnant water and wet earth. They were in a low-lying area, a basin that seemed to collect the island's primordial essence. Suddenly, the terrain opened up. They stood on the edge of a vast, swampy clearing. The electric fence continued on their right, curving away into the gloom. To their left, an equally formidable barrier of thick steel bars and heavy-gauge wire mesh ran perpendicular to it, creating a massive corner, a square kilometer of enclosure at least. "What is this?" Lex whispered, her eyes wide. Alan stepped to the very edge of the clearing, peering down. The ground sloped away sharply, ending in a black, glassy expanse of water. A lake or a lagoon that seemed to have been carved specifically for this enclosure. It was at least 100 meters across, its far bank a sheer concrete wall that met the high fence. "Aquatic containment," Alan murmured, a chill running down his spine. "The main park only has the T-Rex and the velociraptors," Tim said, his voice trembling slightly. "The brochure, the tour, it didn't mention any of this." "Hammond held out on us," Alan said, a bitter edge to his voice. He scanned the lagoon, his eyes adjusting to the twilight. The surface of the water was disturbed by a slow, rhythmic current emanating from the center. It was a gentle, rolling swell, like the breathing of a vast, sleeping creature. "Listen," Lex said, her voice tight. The Parasaurolophus calls were closer now, a chorus of anxious honks coming from inside the enclosure, somewhere to their left, near the concrete wall of the lagoon. They sounded stressed. "Tim, are there any large aquatic dinosaurs? Something reptilian?" Alan asked, his mind sifting through fossil records, searching for a match for this terrifying infrastructure. Tim thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. There's Deinosuchus. It's not a dinosaur, technically. It's a crocodilian, from the late Cretaceous. It was huge, 40 feet long, bigger than a T-Rex. It hunted hadrosaurs. Alan felt a knot of dread tighten in his gut. Deinosuchus, the terrible crocodile. A predator known for ambushing dinosaurs at the water's edge, crushing them in its jaws. To recreate such a thing, to keep it in a contained environment. That's it, Alan said, his voice grim. This is its home. As if summoned by his words, the water near the center of the lagoon broke. It wasn't a splash, but a slow, deliberate displacement, like a submarine surfacing. A shape rose, low and broad, darker than the water it displaced. At first, it looked like a moss-covered rock, a piece of the landscape come to life. Then an eye opened. It was the size of a dinner plate, a cold, yellow orb with a slit pupil so black it seemed to absorb the failing light. It swiveled in its socket, scanning the shore. It saw them. Lex gasped and grabbed Alan's arm. Tim froze, his breath hitching. Slowly, deliberately, the rest of the creature's head emerged. The snout was long and massive, bristling with nodular osteoderms, a living battering ram of bone and muscle. The jaws were partially agape, revealing a row of conical teeth the size of daggers, set deep in gum tissue that looked as hard as concrete. The sheer scale was impossible to process. It made the T-Rex seem almost delicate by comparison. Alan, Tim whispered, it's looking at us. The Deinosuchus submerged again, but they could see the dark, mountainous shape moving beneath the surface, a wake spreading behind it as it began to swim toward them with a terrifying, unhurried grace. It knows we're here, Alan said, his survival instinct overriding his scientific awe. It's territorial. It's coming to the shore. Run. They didn't need a second command. They turned and scrambled back up the muddy slope, away from the lagoon, their feet slipping and sliding. Behind them, there was a deep, resonant chuff as a colossal lungful of air was expelled, a sound like a steam engine venting. They ran along the fence line, following the corner of the massive enclosure, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The high steel pylons of the Deinosuchus pen blurred past them. They needed to put distance between themselves and that lagoon. Alan risked a glance over his shoulder. The water near the shore was churning. A shape impossibly large was dragging itself from the water. The sheer bulk of it defied biology. It was a living tank, a relic of a forgotten age, moving with a low, muscular undulation. Where do we go? Lex cried, her voice strained with panic. The jungle was a solid wall on their other side. Ahead, the fence seemed to curve, leading them toward another section of the park. They had no choice but to follow it. We have to keep moving, Alan yelled. It's bound to the enclosure, but don't get close to the fence. The ground here was uneven, littered with the husks of dead trees and thick, strangling vines. They plunged into a thicket of broad-leafed plants, the leaves slapping at their faces. And then they broke through into another clearing. It was smaller than the lagoon, but just as unnerving. This enclosure was dominated by a dense, artificial jungle, a miniature rainforest. The air here was thick with the cloying, sweet smell of decaying fruit, and something else, something musky and reptilian. They stopped, panting, chests heaving. They were in a corner where the Deinosuchus fence met a new barrier. This one was different. It was a wall of interlocking steel bars, the gaps barely wide enough to fit a hand through, rising just as high as the other fence. Inside, the vegetation was tangled and wild. What is this place? Lex asked, her eyes darting around the clearing. It felt claustrophobic. Alan looked at the signage bolted to a steel post near the corner junction. The paint was chipped, but the words were clear. Borealis Habitat 2, Titanoboa constructus. Warning, extreme containment. Alan's blood ran cold. He knew the name. Titanoboa, a fossil snake discovered in Colombia, a creature from the Paleocene epoch, long after the dinosaurs. It was the largest snake ever discovered, estimated at over 40 feet long, capable of crushing a crocodile. That implied a gene-spliced, engineered variant. A reconstruction. A snake, Tim breathed, reading the sign. A giant snake. Suddenly, a sound tore through the air, a sound that vibrated in their bones. It wasn't a roar or a bellow. It was a low, guttural hiss, a sound of immense pressure and volume, like air escaping a punctured gas main. It came from directly inside the Titanoboa enclosure, mere feet from where they stood. The foliage in front of them rustled violently, frantic thrashing of branches being pushed aside by something immense and powerful. "Get back!" Alan shouted, shoving the children behind him, pressing them against the Deinosuchus fence. A shape moved in the gloom of the Titanoboa enclosure. It was sinuous, undulating. They caught glimpses of it through the dense leaves. A muscular, scale body, thick as a tree trunk, rippling with power. The scales were a mosaic of deep greens and blacks, iridescent in the dim light. Then, a head emerged from the jungle. It was a nightmare. A wedge-shaped head, broad and flat, with jaws that unhinged slightly as they opened. Inside, a gullet that looked capable of swallowing a man whole. The eyes were black, unblinking orbs that held a chilling, reptilian intelligence. The Titanoboa was at least 50 feet long, a serpent of impossible proportions, its body coiled and uncoiled in a hypnotic, deadly rhythm. It was hunting. It wasn't hunting them, Alan realized with a jolt of terror. It was hunting something else. It was drawn to the edge of its enclosure, its forked tongue flicking out, tasting the air. It was sensing the Deinosuchus. As if on cue, a deafening crack echoed from behind them. The sound of massive, serrated claws tearing through steel mesh. Alan spun around. The Deinosuchus was at the fence. It had traversed the clearing and the distance to its own perimeter with shocking speed. It was now less than 30 feet from them, separated only by the high-tensile steel cable. It reared up, its front legs short, powerful, built for grappling, not running, clawing at the fence. The cable shrieked and buckled under the strain. The creature was immense. Its armored back, a fortress of bony plates, rose like a dorsal mountain range. Its tail, thick and muscular, thrashed behind it, churning the mud. But its attention was not on them. It was fixed on the Titanoboa. The two ancient predators were now face to face, separated by a boundary they both instinctively understood and respected, yet coveted. The Deinosuchus let out a deep, guttural roar that shook the air, a challenge from the age of monsters. The Titanoboa responded with a long, sibilant hiss, a sound of pure menace. It reared back, the top third of its body rising vertically, a living tower of muscle and scale, its head swaying from side to side. Alan, Lex, and Tim were frozen, trapped in the precipice between two gods of wrath. They crouched low, pressed against the unyielding steel of the Deinosuchus enclosure, their eyes wide with a terror so profound it transcended fear and became a state of pure, scientific awe. "We're trapped," Lex whispered, her face pale. "If the fence breaks—" "The fence won't break," Alan said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He was a paleontologist, a man of bone and dust. This was something else entirely. This was a war. The Deinosuchus slammed its massive, shovel-like snout against the fence. Clang! The sound was metallic and brutal. The cables groaned, their tension screaming. It was testing the barrier, trying to find a weakness. Its yellow eyes, burning with cold, reptilian fury, never left the swaying head of the snake. "It's trying to get to it," Tim observed, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. "Why? They're from different epochs, different habitats. It's about territory," Alan murmured, his eyes darting between the two behemoths. "The park has kept them in adjacent pens. They can smell each other. They can sense each other. All this time, locked away, the instinct to dominate, to eliminate a rival apex predator, it's been festering." The Titanoboa, for its part, was a study in fluid lethality. It didn't attack the fence. It simply held its ground, its massive body coiled and ready, a spring of compressed violence. It knew the Deinosuchus was contained, but it also knew the crocodile was an invader, a challenger in its domain. Its head continued to weave back and forth, a hypnotic motion that promised a swift, crushing end. With a sudden, explosive movement, the Titanoboa struck. It wasn't a full lunge, but a feint attest. It shot forward, its head a blur, stopping inches from the steel bars of its own enclosure. The speed was breathtaking. It was a whip-crack of muscle and scale. A glob of viscous saliva dripped from its jaws, sizzling slightly as it hit the wet ground. The Deinosuchus recoiled, a primal flicker of caution in its ancient eyes. Then it let out a furious bellow and surged forward again, its jaws opening wide to bite at the fence, its teeth scraping and screeching against the metal. "That's it," Alan whispered. "They're sizing each other up. What happens if the fence gives way?" Lex asked, her voice trembling. Before Alan could answer, the Deinosuchus moved with surprising agility for a creature of its bulk. It pivoted on its haunches and swung its massive tail. The tail, plated with osteoderms like a medieval flail, slammed into the steel mesh of its own enclosure with deafening force. Crunch! The mesh deformed, bulging inward. It wasn't an attempt to break through to the snake, but a display of power. A statement. In response, the Titanoboa uncoiled slightly, its immense body slithering forward until it was pressed against the inside of its own bars. It opened its jaws, wider than seemed possible, and let out a hiss so powerful it blew a visible plume of mist from the enclosure. Inside its gape, they could see the glint of recurved teeth, angled backward to ensure no prey could escape. The tension was a physical thing, a stranglehold on the air. The two creatures were locked in a standoff, a primal dialogue of threats and postures. The children were weeping openly now, silent tears tracking paths through the grime on their faces. Alan felt a profound sense of insignificance, a mortal speck caught between epics. Then, the moment they all knew was coming but dreaded arrived. The Deinosuchus, enraged by the Titanoboa's defiance, threw its entire weight against the corner of its enclosure where it met the Titanoboa's pen. The junction was a weakness. The impact was colossal. The ground trembled. The massive steel post that anchored the corner of the Deinosuchus fence groaned, its rivets popping like gunshots. The high-tensile mesh, designed to contain a 40-ton crocodile, ripped with a sound like tearing canvas. A section of the fence, 10 feet wide, tore free from its post, sagging inward to create a jagged, open breach. The barrier was breached. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The two creatures stared at the gaping hole between them. The Deinosuchus was the first to move. It didn't hesitate. With a guttural roar of triumph, it began to haul its colossal body through the opening, its armored bulk scraping and grinding against the torn steel. The Titanoboa did not retreat. It saw the invasion, the transgression, and it reacted with blinding speed. As the Deinosuchus's head and forequarters pushed through the breach, the snake struck. It was a blur of motion. The Titanoboa's head shot forward, jaws agape, aiming for the Deinosuchus's vulnerable, softer neck. But the Deinosuchus was an ancient brawler. It twisted its head, and the snake's dagger-like teeth scraped harmlessly off the thick, bony osteoderms covering its neck and shoulders. The Deinosuchus retaliated instantly, snapping its jaws shut, trying to catch the sinuous body. The impact was a collision of two worlds. The Deinosuchus's jaws closed on a thick coil of the Titanoboa's body. The snake's scales were tough, but the crocodile's bite was a force of nature, designed to puncture the bone of a hadrosaur. The Titanoboa screamed, a high-pitched, sibilant shriek of agony and rage. In return, it retaliated with its own weapon. It wrapped its body, a living vice of muscle, around the front of the Deinosuchus. It constricted, squeezing with a pressure that could pulverize solid rock. The Deinosuchus's armored plates creaked and groaned under the strain. It was a battle of crushing force versus armored defense. The clearing became an arena of pure, unadulterated violence. The Deinosuchus thrashed, its tail lashing out and pulverizing a dead tree, splintering it to matchsticks. It tried to drag the snake back through the fence, but the Titanoboa held fast, its body anchored deep within its own enclosure. It coiled tighter, its head striking again and again, trying to find a chink in the crocodile's armor, its teeth gnashing against bone. The sounds were horrific, the grinding of scales against osteoderms, the deep, percussive impacts of tails striking the earth, the pained roars of the crocodile, and the enraged hisses of the snake. Blood, dark and thick, began to mix with the ground, the life fluids of two primordial nightmares. Alan knew this was their chance. "We have to go," he hissed, pulling the children to their feet. "Now, while they're distracted." "But where?" Lex stammered, her eyes fixed on the maelstrom of destruction. "The fence it's torn. We go through the tear," Alan said, his voice firm. "In the Deinosuchus enclosure. We can get around the back of it, to the other side. The fight is at the front. We'll stay against the far fence. It's our only way out." He was terrified, but the paleontologist in him saw the opening. The Deinosuchus was fully engaged, its lower body still in its own pen, its upper body and the snake locked in a death grapple in the Titanoboa's territory. The area behind the Deinosuchus, within its own enclosure but away from the fight, was clear. Keeping low, using the mud as cover, Alan led them to the torn section of the fence. The air was thick with the smell of blood and musk. They could feel the shock waves of the impacts. They squeezed through the gap, the torn steel edges snagging at their clothes. They were inside the Deinosuchus enclosure. The ground here was churned mud and the detritus of a creature's life. Massive claw marks, the remains of half-eaten fish the size of kayaks. They hugged the outer fence, moving away from the battle, their hearts pounding. Out of the corner of his eye, Alan saw the fight escalate. The Titanoboa, realizing the Deinosuchus was partly anchored in its own territory, changed tactics. It used its immense length to its advantage. It uncoiled from the crocodile's front and whipped its tail around, wrapping several coils around the Deinosuchus's hind legs, anchoring itself. It was trying to drag the crocodile fully into its enclosure, to bring it into its element, the dense, constricting jungle. The Deinosuchus roared in frustration, its powerful legs digging into the mud, trying to pull itself back, but the snake's leverage was immense. The crocodile's massive tail lashed, striking the snake's body with dull, wet thuds. The Titanoboa's head reared up, and it brought its full weight down, its jaws snapping at the Deinosuchus's back, cracking through smaller osteoderms, seeking the meat beneath. Blood sprayed. A chunk of the crocodile's armored hide was torn away. The Deinosuchus thrashed wildly, its jaws snapping at the air. It managed to twist its head and caught the Titanoboa's neck in its jaws. It bit down, and there was a sickening crunch. The snake's body went rigid, then convulsed violently. But the Titanoboa wasn't finished. With a final, desperate surge of power, it constricted around the crocodile's midsection with terrifying force. There was a sound like a large-caliber gunshot as one of the Deinosuchus's ribs snapped under the pressure. The crocodile bellowed in pain and released its grip. In that moment, the battle reached its climax. The Titanoboa, wounded but not defeated, pulled with all its might. The Deinosuchus, its balance compromised, its legs still wrapped by the snake, stumbled. It fell, crashing to the ground with an earth-shaking impact. The Titanoboa immediately swarmed over it, its vast body coiling around the crocodile's torso and neck, preparing for the final kill. But the Deinosuchus was not dead yet. As the snake tightened its coils, the crocodile's tail swung in a final, brutal arc, its club-like tip striking the Titanoboa's head. The snake recoiled, its grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. The Deinosuchus, using its powerful, short legs, shoved itself backward, dragging its massive body out of the tear in the fence. The snake's coils slipped from its body. The crocodile fell back into its own enclosure with a heavy thud, bleeding from numerous wounds. Its breathing labored. It had been mauled, but it was free. The Titanoboa, its neck bleeding from the crocodile's bite, its body bruised and dented from the thrashing, did not pursue. It slithered back into the heart of its own jungle, its dark form disappearing into the foliage, a low, sibilant hiss trailing behind it, a sound of acknowledgement, if not victory. The battle was over. Alan, Lex, and Tim were pressed against the far fence, 100 yards from the site of the carnage, shivering, soaked, and coated in mud. They had witnessed a spectacle that no human was ever meant to see. It was a moment of profound, terrible beauty, a window into the lost world. The Deinosuchus lay panting, its great sides heaving. It was grievously wounded. Blood poured from deep gouges in its neck and side, and it favored one leg. It slowly dragged itself away from the breached fence, back toward the safety of its lagoon, its primal territoriality satisfied, perhaps, or its aggression sated by pain. It left a trail of blood and broken earth. "We were alive," Tim whispered, his voice breaking. Lex just shook, her face buried in Alan's jacket. Alan looked back at the breached enclosures. He saw the Titanoboa's blood mingling with the Deinosuchus's on the churned earth. He thought of the science, the impossible, hubristic science that had brought them here. Dr. Wu's genetic tampering, Hammond's dream, turned nightmare. They had resurrected not just the creatures, but the very violence of the prehistoric world. They had brought back the predator-prey dynamic in its most raw and brutal form, and locked them in boxes, waiting for the inevitable spark. He saw the irony. They had survived A.T. Rex by stumbling into the territory of a crocodile and a snake, things that had no business existing in the same place, let alone in the same century. "Come on," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. His role as protector, as the adult, forced him to push the awe and the horror aside. "We can't stay here. That fight will draw other things. The T. Rex isn't the only thing that hunts on this island." He led them along the fence, away from the scene of the battle, toward the corner of the Deinosuchus enclosure. He peered around the edge. The lagoon was placid again, the water slowly smoothing over the disturbance. The Parasaurolophus calls had gone silent. Perhaps they had fled, or perhaps they had simply fallen silent in the face of the thunder that had rolled from the nearby enclosure. They found a maintenance ladder bolted to the side of a steel pylon, leading up to the top of the fence. It was their way out. Alan boosted the children up, his muscles screaming in protest. He climbed after them. From the top of the fence, 20 feet in the air, they had a final panoramic view of the two enclosures. The Deinosuchus was sliding back into its lagoon, a living fortress of wounds, disappearing beneath the black water. The Titanoboa's jungle was still a silent, tangled world of green and shadow. Between them lay the scar of their battle, a testament to the chaos that had been unleashed. Alan herded the children down the other side, onto the safe ground of a service corridor. They were out of the enclosures, but they were not safe. The island was still a death trap. But as they stood there, catching their breath, a new sound reached them, carried on the wind. It was the distant, familiar chugging of a diesel engine, a light cutting through the trees. The tour vehicles, the automated system running its loops. There was a road ahead, a way back. Lex looked at Alan, her eyes still wide with trauma, but a flicker of hope in them. They started to run, their exhausted bodies finding a last reserve of strength, their feet pounding on the asphalt. Behind them, the lagoon settled, and the jungle remained silent. But they carried the memory of the fight with them, a brutal, beautiful, and terrifying lesson in the arrogance of man and the enduring savage power of the ancient world.